So, once again, here we are. There's going to be another election in Japan. That's the upcoming lower house election in Japan on February the 8th, 2026. So, why is this happening and what can we expect from this election? Well, as I say, I'm a little bit surprised to sort of be covering another election because we've already had quite a few in a recent space of time. This is the third Japanese election in the space of, I think, about 15 months, certainly under a year and a half. The first one was in October 2024, and that in itself was a little bit of a short election because it was called by the previous Prime Minister Ishiba because he wanted to sort of resolve the issues in his party and give himself a mandate, although that didn't go very well. So October 2024, he called an election before the term was due to run out. Then in July 2025, we had another election, this time in the upper house. That was as scheduled, so that wasn't too much of a surprise. And once again, here we are. It's barely into 2026, and we're having an early February election as well. So why now? Well, the big reason we're having this election is because Japan's new leader, Sanae Takaichi, she's the leader of the LDP, wants her own mandate, really. Similar sort of reasons to why Ishiba called an election. She was elected as the new leader of the LDP, replacing Ishiba. Now, at first, she sort of seemed to be avoiding the idea of calling an early election because that's a mistake, as I say, that Ishiba made, and he ended up losing the LDP's majority by calling a sort of a short election to sort of try and get validation and sort of move the party forward. And it sort of backfired, really. She was probably reluctant to do the same thing, despite in sort of her early honeymoon period, she continued to have very sort of strong polling. Now, she's a little bit further into her term as PM, and she's still getting like quite healthy poll results, so presumably that's the reason why she's decided this is more than just like an early honeymoon blip. I seem to have quite good backing, so I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to call an election, and then that will give me, specifically as the leader of the LDP, a mandate to get my policies and the changes I want. Now, as I say, historically, the LDP is a little bit of a low ebb because they've lost their majority in the previous election in 2024, so she'll presumably be hoping to regain that, or at the very least increase the number of LDP seats, which will be seen as a vote of confidence in the LDP and her personally. And she'll have a little bit more authority and backing and sort of legitimacy to push her sort of more conservative policies and things she might want to do with her government, rather than the position she's in now where she's sort of living on seats that were voted for under a different leader, and she's sort of also in a minority government with reliance on her coalition partner Ishin, so she wants to sort of increase, as I say, the support she has in her mandate personally in order to sort of be more effective and get things through. Presumably that's a big sort of reason why she's calling this election. And you could also argue in a broader sense there's an election now because it's incredibly inevitable ever since we had that 2024 election. I mean, there was the 2024 election where the LDP lost their majority, Ishiba put the LDP into a much more precarious position. So it's sort of inevitable, really, ever since that 2024 election, that because the LDP lost their majority and they're in a much weaker position, but they were still the largest party and so sort of a position to sort of control the government in Japan, that as soon as they got into a situation like Sanae is now, where she started to get consistently good poll ratings, then they were always just going to call an election as soon as they could, because it's not a particularly healthy position to be in, sort of being the largest party, but sort of having had this obvious blow. They want to restore their previous sort of status and go back to being sort of the obvious governing party of Japan. So you could argue from 2024 there was always likely going to be an early election if ever the LDP were in a good position and got good poll rating again. So what are sort of the issues at stake for this 2026 election? What are the voters going to be thinking about? What's it all about? Well, the obvious thing, as I say, is that it's all about Sanae Takaichi. She called this election because she's got very good poll ratings. And because she wants, as I say, increased support for herself personally and mandate to sort of get changes through. And also it's been a very sort of a snap election. I believe she called this in January. She announced the election, and it's February the 8th, the election. So it's a relatively short amount of notice time period to sort of think about it. So you could really say she called it because she wanted more support. She wanted to see if she could convert her poll ratings into a stronger base of support for the party, get more seats in, strengthen her government. So it's really sort of a test if people in the polls seeming to like her and be willing more to support her, whether that will turn to reality once they actually go out to vote. And because there's not that much time to sort of think about other issues, that's really sort of the main focus. It's, you know, are you going to back me or sack me, and follow through on what you say in the polls is really sort of the question in the election. That's what Sanae Takaichi is looking to find out. She might not phrase it that crudely, but she's sort of willing to see if the support for her is that tangible, and that's what she's gambling on. Nonetheless, there are other big issues going on in Japan. that sort of will come up in the campaign. A cost of living is a big one, of course, and elements of that like the rice crisis. I believe part of Sanae Takaichi's pitch, and the reason she's asking support from voters is that she's going to change the consumption tax. I believe she's going to get rid of the consumption tax on food for a period of time. She's going to get rid of it for 2 years, I think. And she's hoping that will address things like the cost of rice and make just life and the cost of living a bit more bearable for Japanese citizens. And so that's sort of a bit of the offering she's putting out there to sort of address concerns about the cost of living in Japan. And so it remains to be seen if that's going to be a convincing pitch and if they'll look to her sort of policies on that rather than other parties. And there's also an element of global tensions. There's sort of this diplomatic sort of standoff between China and Japan, and also sort of broadly there's a lot more uncertainty globally than there was, perhaps back in 2024. And there's sort of ongoing diplomatic global issues. So maybe there's an element of who do you want as your leader in sort of a more challenging, difficult sort of global diplomatic situation. And Sanae Takaichi has sort of this image. She sort of models herself as Margaret Thatcher. She's meant to be a big fan of Margaret Thatcher. So there's sort of that strong leader appeal that she's looking to put out there, to be Japan's Iron Lady. And so maybe she's making an argument that in this sort of situation, maybe you want someone a bit more like her. Now, there's a little bit of a perverseness that you could argue to this, because you could argue that the diplomatic situation with China and Japan is more difficult because of Sanae Takaichi. I mean, she made these comments about Taiwan and saying that if China were to make a move on Taiwan, it would be an existential threat for Japan. So it's sort of maybe slightly strange that you could argue that her position as a strong leader, given these tensions, could lead to her being backed. But I think there is some sense in it, because you could argue this was always inevitably going to be a confrontation with China, because if they are serious about Taiwan, that was always going to come to the head at some point. And so maybe some of the moves that Sanae Takaichi is making, which is maybe trying to sort of present Japan's strength and things like boost military spending, maybe they're sort of good to do now while it's just a diplomatic sort of row with China, rather than before it turns into a serious Taiwan situation. And also moves she's making in response to it, like possibly having even closer ties with the USA might be a logical move, you could argue. And also she might be well positioned to do that because she appears to have quite a good relationship with Trump. So, and also you could argue that if it's not a serious situation and perhaps China isn't actually looking to move on Taiwan, then perhaps this will all blow over anyway. But as I say, that's just something you could debate back and forth. Now, as I say, she called this election because she had a nice honeymoon period. She was doing well in the polls, sort of consistently getting sort of, 60s, 70s support for her cabinet in sort of different polls, but nonetheless, there has been difficult news stories that maybe would be of concerning for her in sort of during the period of this election campaign. For one, the Unification Church scandal has sort of reared its ugly head again. And this sort of scandal where the Unification Church, which is quite a controversial church, was tied to Shinzo Abe and the LDP and LDP lawmakers. That was a big sort of reason why the party was tainted, why Ishiba in 2024 felt he had to call an election, and also why maybe the LDP in 2024 lost votes, lost support. That's come out again because there's a story where there's reports that it's suspected that the Unification Church could have possibly been involved, allegedly, in buying tickets for Sanae Takaichi's fundraisers, which ties her personally, if that were to be true, to the Unification Church and would be bad for her, and sort of reminds everyone of the existing scandal that she would be hoping to move on from. Also, though, it's worth mentioning that Noda, the leader of the second biggest party in Japan, is also tied up in this. He's been linked to meeting them allegedly in 2001 per reports. Obviously that's a long time ago, but his name is also associated with this recently as well, so that's a negative for him. There's also been some sort of discomfort in the bond market and sort of raising the cost of Japanese borrowing through bonds, and sort of investors getting nervous about the prospect of holding Japanese bonds. That's because of maybe partially down to Sanae Takaichi's spending plans, things like her wanting to spend more on the military and her pledging to do things like cut the consumption tax. Arguably that's led to a little bit of volatility in the Japanese bond market. And so maybe that's something people could be concerned about as well. And the comparisons, if you follow UK politics, to Liz Truss and her sort of a bold budget and that upsetting the bond market are obvious, given that they're both sort of conservative women who were to some degree influenced by Thatcher, you could argue. Obviously, it's not a perfect comparison, Liz Truss and Sanae Takaichi, but just to throw that into the mix. And also, there was a poll, I believe, one poll in particular from the Maichi Shimbun that caught my eye, where there was an approval drop for the government. And it also said in particular that 40%, or possibly more than 40%, said they did not approve of dissolving Parliament to have an election now. Despite all that, though, I read in the Japan Times that the polling for Sanae Takaichi still seems to endure and be quite positive, and that they're even saying that she could win a standalone majority, so a majority for the LDP, not just with Ishin, of 233 or more seats. So that suggests that she's doing very, very well, despite those sort of negative news stories coming out sort of around now. If that holds out through the election, she'll be very, very happy with that. So sort of moving on from what sort of some of the issues are in the election, I want to sort of go by party and sort of look at the position they're in, and also think about sort of what they're targeting, what their position is going into this election. Now, the LDP is the obvious place to start. That's Sanae's party and the government of Japan. I think you have to say, surely, given that this whole election was called because they wanted to strengthen their position, because they were doing well in the polls, and because they clearly wanted to strengthen their hand and their position in the House, that if they were to do anything less than gain seats, you would have to see it as a big, big failure, misstep. I think really you could argue that they should be aiming to sort of at least get a majority back, where with Ishin they had 233 seats combined, if not just the LDP on the alone getting 233 seats. Given that's historically something they've been able to do, is what they should be aiming for. But I think if they were to fail to, at the very least, gain seats, I think it would be very bad, and possibly career-ending as a PM for Sanae. As I say, it's looking very good for her at the moment. I think she would be, this is just my personal opinion, if she were not to be able to reclaim an outright majority, but she were at least to gain seats, then I think she can at least say that she's got some sort of vindication and backing for her personally. She's improved the position of the LDP by gaining seats, and she would be in a position to carry on, even though if it's not an ideal result, given that she dissolved the House, hoping a strong backing of support. If she's at least got something to show for it, I think, in my opinion personally, I think she could carry on if she were just to get some more seats. But I think she would definitely be hoping for more than that. There was even a story, I believe, that Sanae Takaichi might be looking to resign after this election if she didn't get a majority outright. I think that despite these negative news stories, I think the LDP can expect to be at least somewhat optimistic about things. And as I say, I expect them to at the very least gain seats. That's my personal opinion. But it's very interesting. You sort of don't know what to expect in these sort of short snap elections. But we'll just have to see where we are. But as I say, I expect the LDP to do reasonably well of this, and for Sanae to be in a position to carry on, but we'll just have to wait and see. A possible cat among the pigeons, a sort of a thing that's disrupted things, is that not long after the election was announced, there was a sudden merger. And so another party you have to now look at is the Centrist Reform Alliance, which has replaced the Komeito party, who was sort of the old coalition party of LDP. Who were sort of long-suffering, had sort of lost support through being their coalition partner, and in the end left the coalition, which made LDP partner up with Ishin. And remarkably, CDP, who were sort of the biggest sort of opposition party, sort of the challengers to the LDP, they've sort of combined forces and made this new party, Centrist Reform Alliance. So the pros of this are, of course, that they're now a much bigger party. It's taken everyone by surprise. It's got them a lot of attention, and it's allowed them to sort of pivot to where they think they should be, which is sort of, as I say, a centrist party, whereas traditionally CDP were more of a left-wing party. But they can now pitch themselves as this sort of exciting new centrist party, maybe more in a position to challenge LDP. And also, of course, they now have much more seats combined. They have a stronger organisation, more fundraising. Komeito, in particular, are meant to have good sort of organisational links to sort of Buddhist organisations on like a good ground game, particularly in Osaka, I think. So they're bringing all that during an election, added to CDP's existing strong position as the second party in Japan, the biggest opposition party. So presumably they'll be hoping to continue to do well, continue being the biggest opposition party combined. It would be a big failure for them to fall off that perch, given that CDP alone were the biggest opposition party. And if they're hoping, if they do well, to presumably their aim would be to be at least the second biggest party in Japan, as I say, and possibly to knock the LDP off their perch a bit and to stop them gaining an absolute majority, and to create a situation they would hope where, if things went well, they could form a coalition with lots of parties to block the LDP potentially. That would be presumably their aim. There is perhaps some difficulties with this because forming a new party, you're sort of abandoning your old existing identity. It sort of forces traditional voters who would vote for you to sort of think about who the new party is, whether you want to continue to lend your support. You can be accused of abandoning your existing identity, and particularly because, as I say, CDP are moving sort of more from the left to the centre. Komeito for years have been associated with the LDP. Now they're moving in with their biggest rival. And you could also argue it's such a sort of a snap election, and they've suddenly announced this merger. Maybe it sort of doesn't give time for people to sort of think about who they are and for them to get their message and their identity out there. And it also might be seen as sort of quite a cynical move to sort of suddenly do this before an election and change your identity and not give people long to think about it. So that is a potential challenge people could this new party could face. But we'll have to see how it's perceived and in the end how they do in the polls. The next party I want to look at is Ishin. They're sort of, as I say, the partners now to the LDP in government. And you could maybe argue that they've had a little bit of a tough time of late. They've sort of not got as many of the things. They had this big list of demands they had of the LDP. They've not really got them through. They've only been in coalition a short time. But that sort of ties them as sort of being associated with the LDP in people's minds, in joining them in coalition. So they haven't got like you could argue, an amazing amount of things back from the LDP, but they're associated with them when they sort of originally sort of pitched themselves as sort of an alternative conservative party, like an alternative to the LDP, and yet here they are now in coalition government and running as a coalition partner of the LDP. So that's arguably a sort of a tough position for them to be in. Another difficulty they have is there's recently been a little bit of a reported scandal where local politicians representing Ishin are allegedly have not been paying the sort of the NHI insurance, healthcare insurance premiums, and so they've, as a result, sort of been tainted by that scandal. Ishin, at least the local politicians have, and as I say, coalition partners always seem to, at least in many cases, struggle. That's something that happened to Komeito. They ended up losing support and votes over time through association with the LDP. And so it would be interesting to see if the same thing will now happen to Ishin as a result of being their coalition partner. And a particular thing to look out on, as I say, will be Osaka, which has sort of been a big regional base of support for Ishin. Komeito have now joined with the CDP. They've combined forces, and as I say, they'll presumably be combining their ground game there. So it'd be very interesting to see, in particular, how Komeito and CDP do there, and if that could hurt Ishin, and if they could maybe sort of take away some of the support base that Ishin have, particularly in Osaka, from them. I suppose the main thing you could say is that at least Sanae Takaichi is fairly popular. She's doing reasonably well in a lot of polls, so perhaps that might rub off on Ishin, or at least they're not exactly this position where Komeito were in, where the LDP were sort of suffering from scandals and were sort of not doing particularly well in the polls in the times when they suffered in many of their elections where they lost seats, sort of 2024, 2025 as examples. So maybe they're not quite in the same position, and maybe some of the popularity of the current government and the position they're in now in the polls will rub off on Ishin. That's sort of what they'll be hoping for, I would think. Another interesting party to think about, of course, is Sanseito. They're sort of a populist right-wing party who sort of came in to sort of challenge the LDP and sort of fight them on the right, on their right flank, and to be an alternative sort of populist right-wing party. However, maybe their position is now a little bit interesting because that they made great gains. In particular, they got 3 seats in 2024, and they had a really good result in 2025 where they gained a number of seats. But that was when Ishiba was the leader. He's more of a centrist, not doing particularly well in the polls, not as popular as Sanae Takaichi is right now. And so maybe their position is more of an interesting one. One report suggests that I read is that they could get 15 seats, which would be very positive for them. It's sort of a similar number to what they got in the upper house election in 2025. That's a big15 on the 3 seats they got in 2024, so that would be great if that actually is in actuality what they get. Apparently it's being reported that they want themselves a 10-fold increase, so that'd be about 30 seats, which is incredibly punchy and would be a remarkable vote of faith and a real coming onto the scene as a major party for Sanseito. If that actually were to happen, that would be incredible, and that would really put the cat among the pigeons and show sort of the strength of sort of renewed right-wing politics in Japan if that were to actually happen. It's an interesting tactic, I think, they're trying, where they're sort of appear to broadly be sort of not criticising Sanae because she's quite popular and she's more of a conservative leader than the LDP have in the past. And she's sort of maybe in a little bit more of a position where the Sanseito would present themselves. So they're sort of not really attacking her and saying, oh, she's not really conservative, but still saying, put us in office so that we can sort of support populism in Japan and support Sanae. And sort of maybe they're making the argument that if you have a strong Sanseito party, and this is me putting words in their mouth, if you have a strong Sanseito party in parliament, that stops a situation like the party, the LDP, putting another centrist in power, which of course has happened in the past. And many in the party wanted Koizumi rather than Sanae Takaichi to be the leader. She sort of quite narrowly in the end got in. Many didn't expect her to win. They thought Koizumi, who's more of a centrist, would win. And the LDP has had centrist leaders in the past, of course. And it also maybe it's a little bit of a protection to sort of say, don't let, although many people seem to like Sanae Takaichi, don't let her talk right when it comes to an election, campaign right, and then govern centre or govern left. And if you have Sanseito win, you could argue the LDP will find it much more difficult to sort of drift back to the centre or even to replace Sanae Takaichi. They find it much more difficult if there's a very tangible Sanseito threat on their right. That's not something I've necessarily heard them say exactly, but that's my thought on sort of their position of, I think they're sort of pitching themselves as a little bit of a shield for Sanae Takaichi, saying, oh, if you're in, it sort of shows the danger of retreating to the centre again, or of thinking of challenging Sanae Takaichi too much. And that's backed up by the fact that Sanseito seem to really be targeting sort of, to use British political parlance, the wets, or sort of the soft LDP members who aren't as supportive of Sanseito, or soft from, if you're thinking you're a Sanae Takaichi supporter, you're more on the right of the party. And I think they're really going after figures like Ishiba, who, if they were managed to unseat him, that would be a massive upset, a massive coming out moment. I mean, Ishiba's a former prime minister, of course. He was just last year, he was the leader of Japan. And he's been in the LDP, and he's been a big political figure for years and years. So if they actually pull that off, that would be quite a statement. But I think their general position is they're really sort of targeting efforts in areas where politicians, yes, they're members of the LDP, and they're running in Sanae's government, but maybe the person necessarily isn't in Sanae's camp traditionally. They're not the most right-wing members of the LDP. They're targeting sort of centrist members. So maybe that's a sort of an appealing pitch to voters who are more conservative-minded and don't necessarily dislike Sanae, but the actual person running in their district isn't necessarily as conservative as she is, and so they think, well, we could put Sanseito in because we like them, they have a pitch we like, and they can maybe put a little bit of pressure on the centre of the LDP and support Sanae within Parliament and sort of keep her honest. If she or anyone in the party is sort of tempted to drift away from the right of Japanese politics. So that's a very interesting pitch, and it will be interesting to see if they manage to unseat many LDP members, if that's an effective message, and if they get anything close to sort of these punchy targets they're talking about, like 30 seats, which would be remarkable, or if perhaps it would be close to 15, like, as I say, I saw in that one report. But in any case, they could, if any of those reports are true, get a very big increase in seats, which would be interesting. Next, I want to talk about the Reiwa party, who are in an interesting position. They're one of the few left-wing parties in Japan who've had some growth recently in recent elections. Unfortunately, their leader, Toru Yamamoto, has he's stepping back to some degree. He's remaining the leader of Reiwa, but I believe, unfortunately, he's had health concerns. And so for that reason, he's not going to continue in his position as seeking to retain his seat, although he's remaining, as I say, the leader. So, of course, I wish him the best. It's not nice to hear that he's, of course, got health concerns. But that's also very unfortunate, as well as, of course, personally. It's unfortunate for his party because he's a sort of a big part of their appeal. He's a celebrity. He's a very sort of big personality as well. And he's really personally associated with the Reiwa movement. And so they would really hope to continue to have his sort of, big presence, Reiwa. So, they would obviously, I wish him the best with his health concerns, of course. But it's a sort of a big loss for them if he's not as much involved in seeking to retain a seat, of course, although he remains leader. Reiwa presumably are in an interesting position because politics in Japan does seem to be shifting a bit to the right. I mean, you have Sanseito potentially doing well. You have Sanae taking the LDP sort of further to the right, and then you have CDP, the second biggest party, who are traditionally something of a left-wing party, drifting to the centre. And so they're sort of the only left-wing party, you could argue, who's arguably, in recent elections, grown. And you could argue the communists and the SDP have struggled a bit. So they're sort of in an interesting position, Reiwa, is maybe they, on the one hand, yes, generally the left is struggling, but they're sort of the only obvious party that are doing well in recent elections. So maybe that if you're not happy with what's being offered by Sanae Takaichi and the sort of the driftwood towards the right in Japan, maybe they're the obvious conduit to go and support them instead. So it'd be interesting to see how they do in that respect. I imagine they would be happy to have some sort of growth. If they got additional seats of any sort, I think that would be a good result for Reiwa, I would think, given that the left is maybe in general going for a little bit of a tough time in Japan. But it'd be very interesting, as I say, to see if that's borne out, if they continue to have strong results like they have in recent elections. The Communist Party of Japan are in a difficult position. As I say, the left is sort of struggling a bit. They've declined in recent elections. They've lost seats, lost support, and they've lost a big figure in Kazuo Shi, who I believe is a former leader of the Communist Party. He's a big figure in the party. He's stepping down this election. And so that's a big loss of a key figure in the Communist Party. And as I say, they have sort of been drifting the Communist Party. They would hope maybe to be the conduit of support and resistance to a driftwood right in Japanese politics, but instead that seems to be going towards Reiwa. And so I think, sadly, it's, from their point of view, it's going to be, I would assume, a position of continued decline possibly for them, having lost such a big figure in going into this election. I would imagine they would be happy to hold on to the seats they have, but I personally, this is just my personal opinion, I wouldn't be surprised if they lost possibly more seats and had a little bit more of a decline. The Conservative Party of Japan, Naoki Haikuta's vehicle, is very interesting. They've gone for a big riff recently where they've had parties, members of the party actually leave. They brought a lot of politicians in from a sort of a Nagoya local party who sort of really bolstered their support, gave them the base of support in Nagoya. But now, because of a rift between the former mayor of Nagoya, who joined the Conservative Party of Japan, and Naoki Haikuta, they've sort of fallen out. And then now the Nagoya faction has left. So it'll be very interesting to see how that Nagoya faction, if they stand in 2026 independently, how they do. And also how Conservative Party of Japan do, having lost that sort of key base of support, having been publicly been seen as having this rift as well, and having been seen publicly as having lost seats and gone backwards. Now, they had solid elections, in 2024. They got 3 seats. I believe they got 2 in the 2025 election, the upper house. But now, after this big rift, I think that's really set them back. They've lost that Nagoya support base, and they're in a difficult position because, as I say, they've got Sanseito, who are also pitching to the traditional Conservative Party of Japan voter, who tends to be sort of older and male, is the sort of the key support base of sort of Conservative Party of Japan. Sanseito recently made a pitch to them by saying, we're the LDP of the good old days, i.e. if you're an older voter who used to support the LDP but you're disaffective, you can come over to us. So that's sort of maybe a little bit of a pitch, you could argue, they made at Conservative Party of Japan voters. And also Conservative Party of Japan voters, they were set up, you could argue, to take votes from the LDP after they passed the LGBT Understanding Act, which is what caused Naoki Haikuta to set up the party to begin with and to sort of create a party on the right challenging the LDP. Well, now you also have Sanseito, who arguably are capturing more attention and gaining more seats, and you have the LDP, you could argue, reverting back to where they were traditionally by going more to the right and electing Sanae Takaichi, who's doing very well. You might argue the key appeal of Conservative Party of Japan is diminished a bit because, on the one hand, if you're a traditional LDP voter who was upset, now you possibly might go back to support Sanae Takaichi, who's doing well in the polls. And if you're looking for a populist party to sort of upset the apple cart, you could also look to Sanseito, who arguably are growing faster and maybe are a bigger threat to sort of establishment and sort of centrist parties, sort of the centre-right in Japan. So that's a sort of a difficult position for Conservative Party of Japan to be in, to sort of have these losses and sort of have this increased challenge to where they were in 2024. Nonetheless, Naoki Haikuta is a big personality. He's famous. He's sort of gathers a lot of attention online. So I would think perhaps he could draw in some votes, possibly through the block vote. And so, although they might not do as well as they have in the past, possibly they could hold on to sort of maybe 1 or 2 seats. So it'd be interesting if it is a sort of a complete retreat for the Conservative Party of Japan, or as I say, if they're able to hold on to something and sort of build from there and sort of make a base for themselves from there and sort of regather having lost this Nagoya support. So that'll be an interesting one to watch to see if they can get anything out of this election. Next, the Democratic Party of Japan. They did well in the last 2 elections. They're sort of a growing party. Arguably, they are a little bit challenged though, because this centrist reform alliance have moved to the centre, whereas traditionally CDP were more of a left-wing party, as I say, so maybe that's sort of crowding them out as a sort of a centrist choice a bit. They have a very punchy target of 51 seats, which would really upset the apple cart. That would be a fantastic result for them. Very punchy, given they're currently on 26. So that's their stated target. I imagine they would be happy to grow and at least have a positive narrative, even if they fail to reach that target of, as I say, very punchy of 51, that very ambitious target. And given that Sanae's popularity, perhaps that would be quite difficult for them to capture, but we'll have to wait and see. I mean, they've done very well in the past 2 elections, and I believe they're sort of making a sort of a pitch along the lines of, we want to put more your money in your pocket, we want to make things better for sort of ordinary voters, and improve your wages and tackle the cost of living. That's sort of the pitch. They're sort of not wading into, I think, sort of being pro or anti-Sanae as much, but they're sort of just focusing on the core issues of, like, we're a centrist party, we want to improve the lives of ordinary voters. That's their message, I think. So it'd be interesting to see how close to that target they get and how well they do. They've done well in the last 2 elections, I believe, the DPFP, so it'd be interesting to see how they do in general, and also how they do compared to this centrist reform alliance, who are arguably pitching themselves in the similar territory. And very finally, it'd be an interesting one to look at is Team Mirai, who are looking to gain their first seat. They had a breakthrough in the 2025 upper house election, and as I say, they're sort of a party that targets young voters. They're not maybe hard to place in sort of the traditional left-right divide, but they're sort of like an AI sort of progressive forward-thinking party is sort of how they present themselves. And I've seen they've got something like over 4% in some polls. I saw one poll with them on 4.4. So it'd be very interesting to see if they can break through, similar to how they did in the upper house, and possibly gain their first seat. So that'd be very interesting as well. Sort of a new party could potentially be introduced that way. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the issues are in this election, where the parties are at, what they're aiming for, and what the stakes are, and sort of what their realistic targets and what they're going for, and gives you a bit of an overview, as I say. But yeah, thank you so much. This has been the preview of the Japan 2026 election. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.